This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lodger was veiled, the face was yellow, and the valley was fearsome, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what kind of medical practice Dr. Watson actually ran? Or about the number of Holmes's monographs? Or how much the rent was at 221B Baker Street?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Something amiss in the Three Gables. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you fully gabled today?
I am gabled and grabled. I've got Betty Grable on one side and three other Gables. No, well, they're not Gables.
Clark Gable, Betty Grable, and the seven Gables.
The seven, no, those were the seven little, those were the seven little boys.
The seven dwarfs. Now, let me ask you this. We have three Gables here. Nathaniel Hawthorne had his famous House of the Seven Gables. Do Gables ever come in even numbers?
Oh, now, isn't that an interesting question? I think architecturally, the inclination is to have more variety than symmetry. And I actually was at the House of Seven Gables in Massachusetts. Is that in Salem?
It's
I
in
guess
Salem.
It was in Salem.
Yeah.
And the way that building evolved over the centuries was that at one point there was just one gable. So it was the story of the little gable and how it grew.
The little gable that could.
But as the property expands, one morning you wake up and there are five gables, and then a few years later there are only six, and then there's seven.
They're like the rabbits of the architectural world. Who knew?
But I do think the trend is towards away from symmetry and more towards multiplicity of gabledom.
Well, good. Well, we're going to look at some of the irregularities in the Three Gables, but before we do that, just a reminder that the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles249, all lowercase, and that'll get you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, to the show notes for this particular episode, where you can comment, you can link out to other places, you can download the episode, or you can connect with us however you'd like. We have all of our social handles there, and of course our email address, which is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And thank you for the continuing support that we're seeing. That helps us to continue to pay for all of the behind-the-scenes technology that make the show possible. Well, by the time we get to the Three Gables in the Sherlock Holmes stories, it is late in the season. It is in the casebook. And we've already experienced three students at that point. We have yet to experience three Garadebs, but we are sandwiched in between here with the Three Gables. This is, it's a familiar trope, let's just say. This is, someone is sitting on something valuable and is not aware of it, and the villain of the story is trying to get them out of the way so they themselves can claim that valuable object. We've seen it in the Three Garadebs. We'll see it in a few stories. We've seen it in the Red-Headed League. This whole notion of getting to something by some sort of furtive design, usually impersonation or some kind of cock and bull story that makes somebody move. So, this is really not one of the better stories for a lot of reasons, but rather than pick apart the structure or the casual racism of Sherlock Holmes or anything like that, I thought we could actually concentrate on some inconsistencies in the story or some irregularities and call them out. How does that sound to you, Bert?
Sounds great. Absolutely great. And this is a fertile stomping ground because, as you say, we are in the casebook. This is one of the later stories. It appeared in America first on September 18th in 1926 in Liberty Magazine, and then was published in The Strand in October of 1926. And as you just said, it's in the casebook along with the three Garridebs. So you do have these threes popping up here towards the end of the publication cycle of Sherlock Holmes' original cases.
Indeed. So, most of the casebook are, stories that aren't very memorable or that aren't necessarily as robust as earlier ones. I think you can call out some of the better stories like The Illustrious Client,
yes,
The Sussex Vampire, The Thor Bridge, which we've talked about recently.
Yep.
But maybe The Creeping Man. The Lion's Mane is an odd one, definitely of interest for you exotic animal fanciers. We talked about that earlier with jellyfish. But again, you've got two stories in this cycle that are narrated by Holmes, The Blanched Soldier and The Lion's Mane. You've got one that's narrated by we don't know who. That's The Mazarin Stone. So it's just an odd collection. So just as a reminder, Holmes is being engaged on a case by Mary Maberly, who is an elderly woman, has moved into this house about 2 years ago, and suddenly there are offers to her to buy the house out from under her, but she can't take anything with her. And I guess that makes the old saying true. You can't take it with you. That was exactly how the legal contract was designed, from what I understand, in the three Gables. But in her note, she says, I believe that my late husband, Mortimer Maberly, was one of your early clients. I thought, well, that's interesting. Would this have been one of the pre-Watson clients? Because we've never heard of Mortimer Maberly via Watson before.
No, not at all. And we know there was a period in Sherlock Holmes' practice as he began to build his practice and his reputation in which he would see large numbers of people. And Watson himself remarks on this curiously in Study in Scarlet, the people who would come and Holmes would control the sitting room and they would have a conversation. And of course, in that time period, Holmes says, yes, I listened to their words and I listen to their story and I give them my opinion and I pocket my fee. And Mortimer Maberly may well have been a contributor of some of those shillings and pence in Holmes's early days.
Yes, indeed. So Holmes takes the case. He goes out to see Mrs. Maberly, throws her wheezy maid servant Susan out for listening at the door. It's almost like a slapstick stage comedy. This whole setup. I think we're seeing a lot of that in these later stories. These setups that are almost written for the stage.
Yeah, you might be right. Certainly, it's a case that Holmes would probably have ignored. I mean, this is, after all, in he's world famous, and this case is usually dated to take place around 1903, mid part of 1903. So he might not have responded very well to this strange name, even though her late husband was one of your early clients, except for the stage piece of involving him, threatening him.
Yeah, right.
And so now if someone is telling him to, stay away, sure.
In that case, I'll take the case. Absolutely.
Wait a minute. What case is this? Yeah, sure. I'm getting involved in that.
So you've got this threatening boxer or ex-boxer, Steve Dixie. You've got Susan and her husband, Barney Stockdale, who are operating both inside and outside the house. And then you've got the villainess, who it's all technically untraceable to, Mrs. Isadora Klein. Now,
yeah, she's a great character. But before we get there, I just have to point out to your earlier comment about, the mechanic, the cumbersome nature of many elements of the story. Stop for a second and think about the title of this. The title of this is The Three Gables. Okay, well, we're early in the case, and Holmes has shown Mary Maberly's note to Watson. He says the address is The Three Gables, and they have a short railway journey. And what does Watson say? A short railway journey, a shorter drive brought us to the house, a brick and timber villa standing in its own acre of undeveloped grassland. So it's there in the middle of nowhere, sort of in a field. And then Watson says, 3 small projections above the upper windows made a feeble attempt to justify its name. Behind was a grove of melancholy, half-grown pines. Oh. And the whole aspect of the place was poor and depressing.
Oh, the poor pines.
And now this is enough to give us the name of the story.
Right.
The Three Gables, which I guess was an alternative to The Lonely House.
Yeah, or the Three Eves. I mean, I don't know, is there a cutoff for what qualifies as a gable and what does not? Watson seems to be lurching into architectural commentary here.
Yeah.
So, well, let's continue with some of the characters here just after this quick word. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today. All right, we are back talking about the Three Gables. So there's 3 points I want to make here that are things that are a little amiss about this story. The first is when Holmes has this conversation with Mrs. Maberly and tries to narrow down, okay, when the first note arrived or the first overture to purchase the house, had you acquired anything that might have been of interest to these people? And it finally hits her. Oh, my son's luggage, my late son's luggage just arrived here in the last week or two. And Holmes goes, oh, well, obviously that's it. And here's what he says to her. He says, delay no longer, Mrs. Maberly. Have these things taken upstairs to your bedroom. Examine them as soon as possible and see what they contain. I'll come tomorrow and hear your report. Now, what kind of lazy detective work is that? I mean, Holmes had the opportunity right there to say, let's go through these things together and see what might have been of interest to a criminal. But he leaves her. Right? And like so many other cases where Holmes is asleep on the job, nefariousness happens overnight, and he comes the next day. The house has been burgled. Mrs. Maberly has been chloroformed. Her lawyer, who is staying in the next room, was of no use. And an inspector is on the case. Do you remember the inspector's name from the Three Gables?
It is a strange name, isn't it? It's
this is one of the other things that's amiss with this story.
It's not. Is it Sutro?
Sutro was her lawyer.
Oh, that's right. So who is the inspector?
This is a fantastic quiz question. If you're doing Sherlockian society meetings and you put together quizzes, this is a fantastic quiz question.
A bustling, rubicund inspector who greeted Holmes as an old friend. And we don't see any name, so he's not named.
Exactly.
He's never... He doesn't even get a name?
No, that's how much of a side thought this entire story was to Conan Doyle. He doesn't even give the inspector a name. I mean, how odd.
It's true, yeah. And Holmes, small Goose-a-Combo, a bustling, rubicund inspector greeted Holmes as an old friend, to which Holmes does not reply, "Well, Inspector Mumble, very... Very good to see you too."
Right.
How strange.
So that it was very strange.
The only unnamed inspector in
the entire canon. Yeah. And again, could be written like a stage play where, the part of the inspector is played by Burt Wolder.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. So they have the conversation. Just as an aside here, And I should put a link in the show notes to this. Years ago on the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere site, I had done a summary of the 10 dirtiest things ever said in the canon, or the 10 most suggestive things said in the canon. And I don't think I included this one. Mary the maid heard the noise, began screaming out the window. That brought the police, but the rascals had got away. Well, what did they take? Well, I don't think there's anything of value missing. I'm sure there was nothing in my son's trunks. Which is why Isadora Klein dumped him, I guess. I know. Sorry, that's... So anyway, Holmes goes to Langdale Pike and figures out that Isadora Klein had a relationship with Douglas Maberly. She hired thugs to beat him under her window, humiliating him.
That's a good point, though, just to stop for a second about the identity of Douglas Mayberry. There's a scene here. It's another thing about, when they first get to the Three Gables, Holmes says, "Yeah, I remember your husband very well, though it's some years since he used my services, some trifling matter." And then she says, "Perhaps you'd be more familiar with the name of my son Douglas." Holmes looked at her with great interest. "Dear me, are you the mother of Douglas Maberly? But of course all London knew him. What a magnificent creature he was. Where is he now?" Well, she says he's dead. But Holmes, who remembers Mortimer Maberly, although he used his services in some trifling matter years before, and apparently there's this great creature. What a magnificent creature he was, Douglas Maberly. Holmes doesn't connect to Mary Maberly until he gets there and she tells him who Douglas was.
And it seems rather odd. David L. Hammer in The Worth of the Game calls Holmes's description of Maberly, quote, "an unusual tribute from one who was chary of praise and particularly unimpressed with the physical as opposed to the mental." And he says, what does he say? What a specimen he was, or a
magnificent creature.
What a magnificent
creature.
Yeah. I mean, that is so unlike Holmes.
Yeah.
It is really, really odd. Really odd.
Well, there is something that is a little bit more characteristic of Sherlock Holmes, and that, of course, is when they get, as you point out, when they get back to the Three Gables the next day and they find out about the burglary, Holmes whistles. The drama, he says, has come to a crisis and quicker than I'd expected. And he says to Watson, I made a mistake, I fear, in not asking you to spend the night on guard.
Yeah. Or of not opening the trunk yourself. I mean, my gosh. So it turns out Isadora Klein was after a manuscript that Douglas Maberly had written, a memoir of sorts that would have exposed her. She's engaged to a young man, and her reputation would have been in tatters had this made it to the publishers. And she had the house burgled, the manuscript stolen. She burned it there in her fire grate. And here we have again one of the universal solutions that Sherlock Holmes has for when dastardly deeds happen. The solution is travel. Right, we've talked about in the Priory School, James Wilder going to Australia. We've talked about Jackie Ferguson and the Sussex Vampire taking a 1-year round-the-world trip. Well, Mrs. Maberly wanted to travel. She said, I've always wanted to travel, right? If you sold your house, what would you do? I would travel. So as it turns out, she doesn't have to sell her house, and Holmes exacts a price from Isadora Klein. He said, because she's willing to play ball with him, and comes clean about her reasons. And Holmes says, well, I suppose I shall have to compound a felony as usual, which actually it's misprision of felony. And he said, how much does it cost to go round the world in first-class style? Well, the lady stared in amazement. Could it be done in £5,000? Well, I should think so indeed. Well, very good. I think you will sign me a check for that, and I will see it comes to Mrs. Maberly. Now, here's my question. Mrs. Maberly never stated that she wanted to go on a round-the-world trip in first-class style, right? So could Holmes have said, well, Mrs. Maberly, you have a ticket around the world, second class, right? Here's a check for £1,000 to take care of that, right? And he could have skimmed the rest off the top. We don't know.
Wow, but that's not the way. Even this Sherlock Holmes, who seems to be remarkably devoid of insight throughout this case, even our own Sherlock Holmes, even at this stage, still has more of a character, more of a sense of justice, more of personal honor than to permit such a thing.
Well, if he does, if the Sherlock Holmes of the Three Gables does, it is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Hi, Watson! Well timed. Shake hands with Steve Dixie, the pugilist, who might have a future in his profession if he didn't mix with bad company.
What on earth's happening here?